Part 1. The Unlikely Journey. They expected to die on the battlefield. Instead, they woke to the sound of American trains, the scent of wheat, and the laughter of children who didn't know what war was. They were the soldiers of a lost cause, men who had once marched beneath the swastika, who had sung of victory and destiny, now trudged in silence toward the unknown. For many, the journey began in North Africa, under the blazing sun of El Alamein, Tunisia, or Tobruk. For others, it started in the mud of Normandy or the frozen forests of the Ardennes. But no matter where they were captured, their destination would be the same: America. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 425,000 German prisoners of war crossed the Atlantic under heavy guard. They were the defeated, the wounded, and the bewildered. None of them imagined that captivity could mean safety, or that the enemy's homeland would feel, in strange ways, like peace. For Klaus Müller, a young sergeant from Hamburg, the moment of capture came under the blinding African sun. He had joined the Wehrmacht at 18, believing the propaganda that promised glory and order. But after 2 years of heat, dust, and dwindling rations, even the most fanatical slogans sounded hollow. When the Allies swept through Tunisia in 1943, Klaus and tens of thousands of his comrades surrendered. Some wept, others smiled with relief. As one captured officer later recalled, "We were prisoners, yes, but alive." They expected to be taken to England or perhaps a camp in Egypt. But when they were herded onto ships bound west, they realized this was something different. America was not a rumor. It was their next destination. The voyage across the Atlantic was claustrophobic, filled with a scent of salt and sweat. The prisoners were packed into the holds, guarded, but treated not as beasts, rather as men. The Red Cross had ensured the Geneva Convention would be respected. Food was plain but plentiful: bread, canned meat, coffee. For men who had starved in the desert, it felt almost luxurious. The ship rolled through storms that sent waves crashing against its hull. Men swayed and vomited, cursing their fate. They passed wreckage, burned ships, floating debris, the ghosts of the war still drifting in the water. Some prayed for home. Others whispered the names of lost friends. Few spoke of ideology. The Atlantic was too wide for politics. A letter smuggled by one prisoner described it simply: "We are traveling into the belly of the world we were taught to fear." For many, the first sight of America was the Statue of Liberty, shrouded in morning fog. The irony was not lost on them. They had fought for tyranny. Now they arrived under the gaze of freedom's monument. American dock workers paused to stare. To them, these were the faces of the enemy, Hitler's men, the same soldiers who had burned villages and shelled London. Yet here they stood, thin and sunbound, not monsters but men. The trains rolled westward through a landscape unlike any they had imagined. They passed neat farms, red barns, and white churches, the very picture of peace. Some prisoners laughed bitterly. Others cried quietly. One later wrote, "The land was so vast, so clean. It was hard to believe this country was at war." The prisoners were dispersed to more than 700 camps across the United States, from the pine forests of Maine to the desert of Arizona and the endless plains of Kansas and Texas. Klaus found himself in one of the largest, Camp Concordia, Kansas. Camp Concordia covered more than 300 acres. It had barracks, a hospital, a chapel, and even a theater. Inside the wire, it was a small city, German in speech, American in structure. They were issued denim uniforms stenciled with the letters PW. They received canteen coupons, medical care, even pay for their labor. For many, this was the first time they had 3 meals a day. It was captivity, yes, but a paradoxical one. As one former prisoner later recalled, "We had to remind ourselves we were prisoners." It felt, sometimes, like a strange holiday that would not end. In America, the enemy was treated better than many Allied soldiers expected. The Geneva Convention demanded fair treatment, but Americans often went beyond it. There was an underlying belief, part moral, part practical, that decency might weaken knots of fanaticism more effectively than cruelty. Prisoners were allowed to write home twice a month. Their letters, censored but genuine, carried strange news back to Germany. "We are safe. We work. The food is good. The gods are not unkind. For families in the ruins of Europe, such words were almost unbelievable. It sounded like fiction, but to the men behind the wire, it was a reality both comforting and unsettling. Freedom had a face, and it was not the one they expected. Days took on a steady rhythm. Roll call at dawn, work details through the afternoon, letters or lectures in the evening. The monotony was broken only by the whistle of passing trains or the rare visit from military inspectors. Boredom became the camp's quiet enemy. Some prisoners read whatever they could find, American newspapers, worn-out novels, or technical manuals. Others drew, sang, or debated endlessly about the future of Germany. But within the fences, new hierarchies formed. Rank still mattered. Officers gave orders even in captivity. And lurking beneath the surface was ideology, a ghost that refused to die. To the Americans outside, the sight of German prisoners was both startling and mundane. They were the enemy, yet they looked like any other young men. In small Midwestern towns, locals brought food, cigarettes, even Bibles to the camp gate. Some came out of curiosity, others, compassion. For many Americans, this was their first personal encounter with a German, not a caricature in propaganda, but a living human being. They were polite. One farmer's wife recalled years later. They said, "Yes, you almost forgot they were soldiers of Hitler." It was in these quiet exchanges, a shared meal, a passing glance, a borrowed tool, that the walls between enemy and ally began, slowly, to blur. At night, Klaus thought often of home, of his mother's apartment in Hamburg, perhaps already gone under British bombs. He wondered whether his father had survived the Eastern Front, and he dreamed of his fiancée, whose last letter spoke only of ration lines and fear. But he also thought of America, of the kindness of a God who shared coffee, of the sound of laughter from a nearby farmhouse. These were contradictions he could not easily reconcile. The war had taught him to hate. Captivity, it seemed, was teaching him to question. Months passed. The seasons changed. In the heart of a nation at war, the German prisoners found peculiar safety. They were far from the front, far from air raids, far from the rise-collapsing dream. Some felt guilty for their comfort. Others embraced it. A few even began to suspect that defeat might be a kind of deliverance. A chaplain visiting Camp Concordia wrote, "They do not yet realize that they have escaped from hell." As Allied troops stormed Normandy and pushed into Germany, the men behind American fences listened to the radio in stunned silence. They cheered when they heard of their comrade's valor, then fell quiet when the reports turned grim. And yet, as the Third Reich crumbled, many of them were eating 3 square meals a day in the land of their enemy. War had twisted logic. It had made captors humane and captives grateful. The world outside was burning, but inside the wire, life went on. They came to America as prisoners of war. But captivity would do something no battlefield ever could. It would make them question who they truly were. Part 2. Anatomy of a Camp. Behind the barbed wire, a strange new world was built. Part prison, part village, part mirror of the very society that had captured them. Morning came with the sound of the whistle. The same sound every day, sharp and cold in the Kansas dawn. The prisoners rose from their bunks, rows of wooden boards stacked in barracks built for order, not comfort. They shaved with dull razors, buttoned up their denim uniforms marked POW, and stepped into the morning light for roll call. For men who had known chaos and bombardment, the rhythm of captivity felt unreal. Everything was organized, everything predictable. Numbers, names, formations. The day began with German precision and ended with American oversight. Klaus Müller, once a sergeant in the Wehrmacht, was now simply prisoner 201463. But in the peculiar universe of the camp, he still felt the weight of rank. Hierarchies have followed them into captivity, invisible but deeply ingrained. Each camp in America had its own character, some vast and industrial, others quiet and pastoral. But they all followed a pattern, barracks arranged in rectangles, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. Inside, there were kitchens, showers, canteens, and a small infirmary. The Americans called it humane confinement. The Germans called it a paradox. Camp Concordia, like many others, was built to house thousands. From above, it resembled a tidy grid, every block a mirror of the next. Inside, it was a world suspended between war and peace. The guards, many of them young Americans barely older than the prisoners, patrolled the perimeters with a casual air. Most were reservists, not combat veterans. Some had never even seen Europe. To them, these men behind the wire were exotic curiosities, the faces of a distant war now quietly helping with chores, reading newspapers, and playing football in the dust. At 7 a.m., breakfast was served in long, echoing mess halls. Porridge, bread, sometimes eggs or bacon, food far richer than what their families back home could dream of. Klaus remembered the first time he tasted American coffee. It was bitter and thin, but the warmth of it, the abundance, unsettled him. He had imagined America as a land of cold indifference, not a place where even its prisoners ate well. Some of the guards joked that the POWs lived better than they did. And perhaps they were right. The United States, determined to uphold the Geneva Convention, provided more than the minimum. Every man received a daily allowance of calories that would have stunned a soldier on the Eastern Front. They were given medical care, religious services, even libraries. But for all its generosity, it was still a cage. The fences were high, and beyond them stretched a horizon that promised everything they could not reach. Work was mandatory. Each morning, lists were posted on a board outside the command hut, farm details, construction assignments, cleaning crews. Those who refused the work could be disciplined, but few did. For many, labor was not punishment. It was relief, a way to pass the hours, to feel useful. The U.S. military had a problem to solve. The war had taken millions of American men overseas, leaving farms and factories short-handed. The arrival of German POWs offered a solution that was both practical and moral. They could work, they could earn, and they could, perhaps, change. So the prisoners went out under guard, in trucks and trains, to pick fruit, cut timber, and harvest wheat. They worked in fields that stretched beyond sight, their hands blistered but free under the open sky. Klaus was assigned to a harvest crew. The first day, he stood on the edge of a Kansas wheat field and watched the sunrise. He had not seen such beauty since before the war. The air smelled of grass and dust, not blood and cordite. He felt, for the first time in years, something like peace. Back inside the camp, order was everything. The American officers maintained authority, but they quickly learned that German discipline could be both a blessing and a burden. The prisoners organized themselves with almost military precision. There were committees for hygiene, education, and recreation. Notices were written in neat Gothic script. A theater group formed, complete with hand-painted backdrops. A camp orchestra played on Sundays. But beneath the civility, the old division simmered. The Nazis among them, proud, unbroken, still loyal to Hitler, dominated the social order. They enforced silence and obedience. They flew swastika flags in secret, painted eagles on walls, and punished those who spoke against the Reich. For Klaus, who had once believed but now only obeyed, it was a dangerous balance. To speak doubt aloud was to risk a beating. To show defiance was to be marked as a traitor. The Americans, for all their vigilance, saw little of it. To them, the camp seemed calm. But inside, behind closed barracks doors, there were whispers, threats, and sometimes worse. Letters were the lifeline between two worlds. Each prisoner was allowed 2 a month, written neatly in pencil on thin paper, censored by both sides before they reached home. Klaus wrote of the weather, of work, of his health, never of his confusion. He told his mother that America was vast, that the people were polite. He did not tell her that he had begun to question the war itself. When letters came back, they were fragile things, stained, delayed, censored almost to nonsense. Yet they were treasured, passed from hand to hand like relics. A few words from home could quiet even the most restless heart. In the evenings, the camp came alive in quieter ways. Men played chess on handmade boards, carved from scrap wood. They brewed ersatz coffee from roasted barley. They sang folk songs, marching songs, lullabies. The sound drifted through the fences, mingling with the wind and the hum of distant trains. There was a melancholy to it, the sound of men remembering that they were still human. Some studied English, eager to understand the words they heard from their guards. Others attended lectures on literature or mechanics. The camp command encouraged this. Education, they believe, could reform minds as well as fill time. And slowly, in subtle ways, it began to work. Klaus started reading American books from the camp library, translations of Mark Twain, Steinbeck, even Hemingway. He found a strange comfort in their irony, in their quiet faith in ordinary people. He began to see that humanity was not confined by nationality, that the enemy was, in many ways, himself. The Americans, for their part, watched with a mixture of pity and fascination. They were not unkind, but they were cautious. The guard were warned not to fraternize, yet they could not help but talk, laugh, share cigarettes. One evening, an old sergeant named Miller told Klaus, "You boys got lucky. You're eating better than my cousins in Chicago." Klaus smiled. "Then perhaps we should switch places." They both laughed, and for a fleeting second, the war felt far away. Yet not every camp was so peaceful. In some, fanaticism turned deadly. Those who spoke against the riot could be murdered by their own comrades. The Americans called them the hard cases. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, a prisoner suspected of disloyalty was found strangled in his bunk. At Camp Aiken, South Carolina, another was beaten to death for criticizing Hitler. These were reminders that the war did not end at the water's edge, it merely changed its battleground. In Concordia, the extremists held influence but rarely violence. Klaus learned to stay quiet, to listen, and to wait. He no longer dreamed of victory, only of understanding. There were moments of absurd humor, too. Once, an American officer inspecting the barracks found a hand-drawn portrait of President Roosevelt pinned beside one of Hitler. "Why both?" he asked. The German who drew them smiled faintly. "We like to see who's winning." Even in captivity, irony survived. Sunday mornings were different. The chapel, a simple wooden hut, filled with hymns. Some prayed out of habit, others from longing. A few came only to hear the music. The camp pastor, a captured chaplain from Cologne, preached of forgiveness, not victory. His sermon spoke of human decency, of dignity under suffering. Klaus listened, though he was not sure he believed. But one morning, when the pastor said, "The enemy is whoever makes you forget your soul," he felt something shift. Seasons marked time more clearly than calendars. Summer brought dust and the scent of wheat. Winter brought frost that crept through the cracks in the barracks. The years blurred together. Some prisoners kept diaries. Others carved names into the wooden walls. Most simply counted days. When the news came that Germany was burning, that Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne had been flattened, the camp fell silent. Even the guard said little. The prisoners walked in stunned disbelief. Klaus read the names of cities he knew by heart and felt the ground tilt beneath him. Home was becoming memory, and the wire around him felt less like a cage and more like protection. Over time, the camp became its own small world, self-sufficient, strangely alive. Men married through letters, became fathers from afar, mourned losses they could not witness. They planted gardens, painted murals, built model ships. Life, reduced and redefined, found ways to persist. Klaus once wrote in his journal, "Perhaps captivity is only unbearable if you refuse to learn from it." He did not know it then, but that small insight, shared by thousands like him, would shape what came next. In the quiet order of the camps, the prisoners found work, routine, even comfort. But soon, their captors would begin a far more radical experiment, one not of labor, but of the mind. Part 3. The Labor That Saved the Harvest. By the summer of 1944, a strange sight appeared across the American countryside. Men in faded field-gray uniforms bent over rows of wheat, corn, and cotton. The enemy was working the land. But far from barbed wire and battlefields, they were not prisoners of war in the traditional sense. They were rescuers of a nation's harvest. In the heartland of America, the war was being fought with tractors and pitchforks. Millions of young American men were overseas, fighting in Europe and the Pacific. The fields they once plowed stood silent under the relentless sun. Grain rotted in the silos. Apples withered on the branch. The nation's breadbasket was starving for hands. Then came an unexpected solution: the German prisoners of war. 425,000 of them scattered across the United States, many sent deep into rural towns that had never seen a foreigner, let alone a man in a Wehrmacht uniform. They arrived quietly, under military guard, trucked out from base camps to small, temporary work detachments. At first, the locals watched from behind curtains. These were the men whose comrades had torched London, whose submarines had prowled the Atlantic. But desperation overrode suspicion. The war demanded food, for soldiers, for allies, for survival. And so, the paradox began: enemy soldiers feeding the nation that had captured them. The War Department's policy was clear. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to work, but not in war industries. They could pick fruit, build roads, cut timber, or till the land. For every day's work, they earned 80 cents in canteen coupons. Not real dollars, of course, but enough to buy cigarettes, razor blades, or the occasional chocolate bar from the camp store. In return, the farmers paid the U.S. government about 50 cents per man per day. It was cheap labor, but it kept the economy breathing. For men like Klaus, our composite prisoner, the first time he stepped onto an American farm felt like landing on another planet. The air smelled of dust and hay. The fields stretched endlessly, far more vast than the tiny plots of his native Rhineland. The farmer's wife brought coffee and sandwiches to the men, setting them down on a makeshift table. She didn't speak. She just nodded politely and left them to eat. It was a small gesture, but to men who expected hatred, it felt revolutionary. As the months passed, the walls of mistrust began to crumble. The farmers realized these were not monsters. They were young men, some barely 20, polite, disciplined, and surprisingly hard-working. And for the Germans, the routine brought an unexpected kind of peace. After years of destruction and noise, the quiet rhythm of farm life was almost healing. The clank of tools, the hum of cicadas, the faint smell of freshly cut wheat, it reminded them that life could be ordinary again. Some farmers would joke, "The best hired hands I ever had wore field gray." It wasn't unusual for a prisoner to be invited to share a meal on the porch after the day's work, though technically forbidden. In some towns, American children would sneak apples or notes through the wire, shyly practicing their school-baked German. One Iowa woman later recalled, "They were polite boys. They missed their mothers. They cried when we played Silent Night at Christmas." The war seemed very far away in those moments. The labor program became an enormous enterprise. By 1945, more than half of all German POWs in the United States were assigned to some form of agricultural or public works detail. In California, they harvested citrus and cotton. In Wisconsin, they chopped wood in frozen forests. In Texas and Georgia, they picked peanuts and sweet potatoes under the blistering sun. The local economies thrived again, and the camps, once viewed as security risks, were soon seen as blessings. But beneath the surface, the contradictions ran deep. The Americans were paying prisoners for their labor, yet many of their own citizens, particularly black farmhands and migrant workers, were excluded or underpaid. It raised uncomfortable questions about equality and exploitation. But in wartime, pragmatism outweighed philosophy. The crops had to come in. For the POWs, where it became more than survival, it was dignity. The monotony of camp life could drive a man mad. Behind the wire, time stood still. But on the farm, there was motion, purpose, even laughter. Klaus once described it in a letter never sent. "Out here, under the sun, we forget for a while that we are defeated men. We dig, we sweat, and we live. The farmer treats us like humans, not soldiers. I sometimes think I am free for a few hours each day." Some prisoners began to admire what they saw, not the power of America's armies, but its sense of abundance. The barns, the machinery, the trucks, it was a world without shortages, without fear. Yet others resented it. They saw wealth and ease and mistook it for arrogance. A few die-hard Nazis sneered at the kindness shown by the enemy. "Don't be fooled," they warned. "This is a propaganda of comfort." But kindness, it turned out, was its own quiet weapon. Stories of transformation spread quietly from camp to camp. In Nebraska, a group of POWs built a small chapel out of scrap lumber on a farmer's property, painting the cross with leftover whitewash. In Mississippi, a local church choir joined with German prisoners to sing hymns in both languages. In Kansas, a farmer's daughter named Margaret would bring cold water to the men each day. One prisoner, Hans, thanked her with a sketch he made in charcoal, her holding a jug under the blazing sun. She kept it for the rest of her life. These were small, forbidden connections, but they spoke of something larger. Humanity was seeping through the cracks of war. Not everyone approved. Military censors were wary of fraternization. Some locals protested, refusing to accept Nazis working their land. And there were moments of tension, escape attempts, petty theft, fights among prisoners. But overall, the arrangement worked astonishingly well. There were few major incidents, and productivity soared. The irony was sharp. The men who had once served Hitler's war machine were now essential to feeding Roosevelt's America. Even the newspapers began to acknowledge it. The POWs have saved our crops, read one headline in 1945. As the months rolled on, the work program became a kind of bridge, awkward, unsteady, but real. For the Americans, it challenged the simple idea of an enemy. They began to see faces, not uniforms. For the Germans, it shattered the myth of the cool, decadent America that propaganda had promised. They found decency, order, and even friendship among the people they were told to hate. It was not peace yet, but it was something close to understanding. And as winter came, the fields went quiet again. The harvest was in, the barns full. The farmers wrote letters to the camp commanders, requesting their men back the following season. The guards, too, relaxed a little. The war in Europe was nearing its end, though none of them yet knew how final that end would be. For Klaus, the rhythm of farm life had become a refuge, but he also felt a strange guilt. He was alive, well-fed, even content, while his country burned. Every letter home took months to arrive, if at all. The thought haunted him. What awaited him when the fences opened? When historians later studied the POW experience in America, they found that this period, the agricultural labor years, marked a profound psychological turning point. For many, it was the first time they had worked for something other than war. It was the first time they were treated as individuals, not ideology. And in that small window of humanity, the seeds of reconciliation were planted. Years later, one former prisoner wrote, "The Americans let us see their real country, not through propaganda, but through their farms, their kindness, their work. It changed me more than any lecture or leaflet ever could." By the time the war ended, German POWs had harvested millions of tons of crops across the United States. They built roads, repaired bridges, and kept entire industries alive. Their contribution was mostly forgotten in the grand sweep of history, but for the farmers who depended on them, and for the prisoners themselves, it was unforgettable. Because amid the sweat and soil, something extraordinary had happened. Two sides of a brutal war had briefly met, not as enemies, but as human beings bound by the same hunger, the same labor, and the same sun overhead. But the tranquility of those fields would soon give way to another kind of battle, not of guns or labor, but of the mind. Inside the camps, a new campaign was beginning, to remake the hearts and thoughts of the defeated. Part 4, Re-Education for Democracy. It began not with guns or guards, but with books. In quiet classrooms behind barbed wire, the United States set out to wage one of the strangest campaigns of the war, a battle for the minds of its captives. By 1945, the war in Europe was drawing to a close. The Allied armies were pushing across the Rhine, and the Third Reich was collapsing under its own weight. Yet in the vast POW camps scattered across the American plains, another kind of struggle was taking place, a moral one. Thousands of German prisoners still carried the ideological baggage of Nazism. Some clung to it fiercely, others questioned everything they had been taught. The U.S. government saw an opportunity, perhaps even a responsibility, to shape what kind of Germany would emerge after the war. And so was born a quietly ambitious experiment, the re-education of the enemy. Officially, it was known as the Intellectual Diversion Program. Its mission was deceptively simple: to replace Nazi indoctrination with democratic ideals, freedom of thought, tolerance, and self-criticism. But how do you change the beliefs of men who had been raised in a totalitarian system? How do you convince soldiers who had fought, killed, and suffered for Hitler that his ideology was a lie? The U.S. Army and the War Department faced this riddle. The solution they attempted was part education, part persuasion, and part experiment in cultural psychology. At Fort County, Rhode Island, the project took its most organized form. The Army assembled a group of German intellectuals, officers, and former journalists, prisoners who had already rejected Nazism. They were to create media that could reach their fellow POWs across the country. Thus began the work of what the prisoners themselves nicknamed the Idea Factory. Inside a former recreation hall, the presses clattered day and night. Out of them came newspapers, essays, and pamphlets in crisp Gothic script. The most famous of these was Der Ruf, the Call. Each issue carried thoughtful articles about democracy, freedom, literature, and the rebuilding of Germany. There were essays on Goethe and Thomas Mann, reflections on civic duty, even quiet discussions of the crimes of the Nazi regime, topics unthinkable only a year before. The writers, all POWs themselves, took risks. They knew their work would be read by men who might still see them as traitors to the fatherland. But they also knew that ideas, once spoken, could travel faster than bullets. Across the camps, education programs blossomed. Libraries were stocked with books in both English and German, novels, history texts, and American classics. Even in the most remote compounds, prisoners could borrow Hemingway or Steinbeck and read about a world where individual conscience mattered more than obedience. Classes were offered in civics, economics, and literature. In some camps, German teachers, often university graduates in uniform, were asked to lecture on subjects banned in Hitler's Germany. Klaus, our composite POW, remembered sitting in a converted mess hall one winter night, listening to an American sergeant explain the U.S. Constitution. The sergeant's accent was thick, and the words sometimes hard to follow, but Klaus was struck by the idea that government could be questioned, that a citizen could criticize his leaders without fear. To men raised in the shadow of dictatorship, this was radical knowledge. Not everyone welcomed it. In many camps, pro-Nazi factions still held sway. They viewed the re-education effort as propaganda, another attempt to break German pride. They tore up pamphlets, mocked the lectures, and sometimes threatened anyone who participated. One former prisoner later recalled, "The hardest thing was not to fight the Americans, it was to fight our own countrymen." To counter this, the U.S. authorities created segregation camps, places where no Nazi loyalists were isolated from the rest. The goal was to let moderate and open-minded prisoners flourish without intimidation. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, for instance, guards quietly observed which men attended lectures and which avoided them. Over time, camp culture began to shift. The men who once whispered Sieg Heil under their breath now debated politics, philosophy, and morality in the barracks. Some of them began to ask, what had really happened back home? What had they fought for? As Allied troops liberated Europe, the first reports of the concentration camps reached American newspapers, and soon the POWs heard as well. At first, disbelief, then denial. Many refused to accept that the regime they served could be guilty of such horrors. Others wept openly when the truth became undeniable. The re-education officers handled this revelation carefully. They showed the prisoners' documentary footage, films taken by Allied soldiers as they entered Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. The screenings were quiet. No one spoke. Some turned away. Others sat motionless, their faces ashen. For Klaus, the images were unbearable. Skeletal faces, children's shoes piled in mountains. The shock broke something inside him that had long been held together by pride. It was here, in those silent holes, that the myth of noble war began to crumble. But the Americans knew they could not simply humiliate their captives. To rebuild Germany, they had to offer something to believe in, not just the absence of Nazism, but the presence of hope. So they turned to culture. Music, art, and film became tools of transformation. Hollywood movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and The Grapes of Wrath were screened in camp theaters. The messages were clear. Democracy was messy, but it was honest. The men watched ordinary Americans standing up to corruption, fighting injustice, and rebuilding their lives after hardship. It was a stark contrast to the propaganda reels of triumph and purity they had once cheered for. The re-education teams also encouraged German prisoners to rediscover their own better traditions, the humanism of Goethe, the philosophy of Kant, the idealism of Schiller. "You do not need to become Americans," one officer told them. "You must become Germans again, but free ones." It was an audacious idea to restore national pride by dismantling fanaticism. For many, the change was subtle, almost invisible at first. They began to question orders that once felt sacred. They discussed politics, religion, and guilt. And most importantly, they learned to disagree without fear of punishment. This, perhaps, was a true victory of the program. It reintroduced the idea that thinking differently was not treason, but strength. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Some remained stubbornly loyal to the old ways. Others simply nodded along, eager to please their captors. Re-education could not remake every heart, but it did plant seeds that would later grow into something unexpected. When the war finally ended in May 1945, many POWs still remained in American camps. The fighting was over, but the process of rethinking had only just begun. At Fort Kearny, Der Ruff continued publication, now openly discussing the rebuilding of Germany as a democracy. It became a bridge between prisoners and their future homeland. When the men were eventually repatriated, some carried issues of the paper tucked in their duffel bags. Others carried notebooks filled with English words, quotations from Jefferson or Lincoln, or scribbled phrases like freedom of conscience. For Klaus, leaving America was bittersweet. He no longer believed in Hitler's Germany, but he wasn't sure what Germany meant anymore. The fences that had once confined him now protected him from a world he barely recognized. Historians would later debate whether the re-education program truly worked. Some called it naive, an idealistic attempt to convert prisoners who just wanted to go home. But others saw its lasting impact. When post-war Germany rose again as a democracy, many of its leaders, journalists, teachers, even politicians, had once been POWs in America. A few had studied in those makeshift classrooms, read those pamphlets, and learned that patriotism and freedom could coexist. Perhaps that was a quiet triumph of the experiment. Not the transformation of every prisoner, but the awakening of enough minds to make a difference. In the end, the re-education program was never about indoctrination. It was about offering choice where once there had been only obedience. It was a belief that democracy could be taught not by force, but by example. And for a few thousand German men behind American fences, that belief would outlast the war itself. But even as some prisoners discovered new ideas of freedom, others turned inward, clinging to the past through art, music, and memory. Behind the wire, a different kind of culture was emerging, one born not of ideology, but of the stubborn will to remain human. Part 5, Culture Behind the Wire. They had lost their war, their country, and their freedom. But behind the barbed wire of America's prison camps, they discovered something unexpected, the power of imagination. When the guns fell silent in Europe and the last transport trains carried their loads of prisoners into the American interior, the war did not end for the men behind the fences. It merely changed form. They were thousands of miles from home, soldiers, mechanics, farmers, teachers, now stripped of rank and purpose. In the beginning, the camps echoed with idleness, men pacing, smoking, staring at the sky. Days stretched into months, time dulled by routine. But human beings, even in captivity, are restless creatures. They cannot live long without purpose. And so, out of the boredom and silence, something remarkable began to grow, a world of art, music, theater, and creation, a culture behind the wire. In Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, a few prisoners built a small stage out of scrap wood. They scrounged curtains from burlap sacks and painted scenery with dyes made from berries and coffee. The first performance was a simple play, a comedy, light-hearted and clumsy, but when the guards and fellow prisoners applauded, something shifted. Soon, every major camp had its own theatrical troupe. Some specialized in Shakespeare, Others staged German classics or wrote original works about life as a prisoner. The audiences were rapt, the laughter real. For a few hours, the men forgot the fences. In one camp, a performance of Faust drew hundreds. The actor playing Mephistopheles, a former drama student from Berlin, delivered his lines with such conviction that even the guards were moved. Afterward, one prisoner wrote in his diary, "For 2 hours, we were men again, not numbers, not prisoners." Music, too, filled the air. Across the country, POW orchestras and choirs took shape. Instruments were made from salvaged wood, tin, and wire. Others were donated by sympathetic locals. There were classical quartets, folk ensembles, even jazz bands, an echo of the very culture the Nazis had condemned. Klaus, our composite POW, found solace in these sounds. He had once played the violin before the war, a hobby lost amid the chaos of battle. In camp, he picked it up again, joining a small group that met each Sunday. They played Bach and Brahms, sometimes American folk tunes. It didn't matter that the strings were old and the bow frayed. Music bridged the silence that no lecture or sermon could. To the Americans who listened from beyond the fence, it was haunting, the enemy making beauty from confinement. Art, too, found its place. The prisoners were ingenious. They carved sculptures from soap, fashioned brushes from hair, and mixed paint from dirt and oil. They drew portraits of their comrades, scenes from memory, home villages, mothers, lovers long unseen. The most talented artists decorated the camp walls, transforming dull barracks into galleries. In Camp Algona, Iowa, the prisoners built a life-size nativity scene from plaster and wire in 1944. The craftsmanship was exquisite, angels with delicate wings, the infant Christ in a cradle of straw. When local townspeople came to see it that Christmas, some wept. That nativity scene still stands today, carefully preserved by the community that once feared its creators. Why did they create? For some, it was defiance, a refusal to let captivity break their spirit. For others, it was nostalgia, a way to rebuild the world they had lost. And for many, it was simply survival. A letter from one prisoner captured it perfectly. We draw because we cannot go home. We sing because our hearts would rot if we were silent. As the re-education programs expanded, these cultural efforts became more organized, sometimes even encouraged by American officers who saw their therapeutic value. Camp commanders realized that a man busy painting or rehearsing was less likely to fight, argue, or escape. But beyond discipline, there was something deeper. The art humanized both sides. Guards came to appreciate the talent and humor of the men they once viewed as dangerous. In some camps, Americans joined in, lending instruments, attending performances, even clapping in rhythmic concerts. The fence was still there, but its meaning was changing. Language, too, became an art. The camps had their own newspapers, handwritten or typed on battered typewriters. They bore names like Lager Echo or Diebruck, The Bridge. These papers carried poems, essays, and sketches, reflections on captivity, on hope, on the absurdity of war. Censors read every issue before publication, cutting anything political or controversial. But even within those boundaries, the prisoners spoke volumes. In one editorial, a young soldier wrote, "We do not ask for pity. We ask to be remembered as men who lived, thought, and dreamed even when behind wire." Theater, music, art, all these things were more than pastimes. They became a quiet rebellion against despair. The men began to rebuild their identities, not as soldiers of a lost cause, but as individuals. The same hands that once held rifles now held paintbrushes and instruments. In Camp Swift, Texas, a group of prisoners even organized a university with lectures on philosophy, physics, and literature. Professors among them taught classes to eager students sitting on makeshift benches. Klaus attended regularly, listening to discussions about Goethe and democracy. He realized that knowledge, like art, could be an act of liberation. For the Americans who watched all this unfold, the transformation was astonishing. They saw former enemies discovering joy and purpose in creativity, and in turn, they saw themselves reflected in those human needs. An American chaplain at Camp Concordia wrote in his journal, They build, they paint, they sing. I begin to wonder who among us is truly free, the men outside the fence or the ones within. Of course, not every camp was peaceful. There were still ideological tensions, especially in the early months after surrender. Some prisoners resented the cultural programs, calling them distractions or propaganda. But as time passed, art and music proved more persuasive than politics. It was difficult to maintain hate while sharing laughter in a play or harmony in a choir. By 1946, the majority of camps had vibrant cultural lives. They celebrated Christmas and Easter, held art exhibitions, even published anthologies of poetry. Some of these works would later appear in post-war Germany, carrying with them echoes of their captivity. The irony, of course, was striking. Inside the wire, the prisoners experienced freedoms of thought, of expression, of creation that many had never known in Hitler's Reich. Outside, America was still a segregated society, wrestling with its own contradictions. But within that confined space, something universal was unfolding, the rediscovery of humanity through creation. When repatriation finally began, many prisoners packed more than just clothes. They carried sketches, notebooks, and music sheets, fragile souvenirs of the world they had built in confinement. Some left behind murals painted on barrack walls, fading now but still visible in forgotten corners of Kansas and Georgia. Others carried melodies that would echo in their memories for decades. Klaus, before boarding the ship home, played one last piece on his violin, Beethoven's Ode to Joy. The notes rose into the night air, trembling against the wire, then fading into silence. For a moment, there was no war, no fences, no sides, only music. The culture that flourished in those camps would outlast the war itself. Years later, many former prisoners became artists, writers, and teachers in Germany's new democracy. They spoke of how, in captivity, they had rediscovered freedom, not the freedom of movement, but of mind and spirit. In that sense, the American camps became unlikely workshops for future peace. But even as art and music brought light to the camps, shadows lingered. Old loyalties had not vanished, and beneath the surface, a darker battle was brewing among the prisoners themselves. A battle not between nations, but between conscience and fear. Part 6. The Enemy Within. Even in a land of peace, war leaves shadows, and within the barbed wire of America's POW camps, not every prisoner had laid down his arms. By 1944, the Nazi regime had crumbled across Europe, but inside the camps, pockets of loyalty still burned. They called themselves Die Schwarzen, the Blacks. Hardline believers who saw surrender as treason and democracy as poison. In the early months, these men ruled by fear. They painted swastikas on barracks walls and whispered threats in the dark. They carried makeshift clubs, passed secret notes, and held trial for prisoners accused of betraying the Reich. To them, even reading American books or attending re-education classes was a crime. To question Hitler was to sign one's death warrant. In Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, a man named Johannes Kuhns, a quiet, middle-aged soldier, began speaking openly about the futility of the war. He listened to the American news bulletins, praised the kindness of the guards, and urged others to accept defeat with dignity. One night, they came for him. Kuhns' body was found the next morning behind the barracks, beaten and strangled, his skull crushed. The killers had left a note pinned to his shirt, "Traitor to the fatherland." It was a message to every prisoner who dared to think freely. The murder shocked the American authorities. It was a brutal reminder that ideology could survive even captivity. The camp commandant ordered a full investigation, an act unheard of among POWs. Witnesses, terrified, whispered names behind closed doors. In the end, 5 men were convicted by a U.S. military tribunal. They were hanged in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, in 1945, the last German soldiers executed on American soil. But the violence was not unique to Tonkawa. Similar murders occurred in other camps in Arizona, Texas, and Illinois. In each case, the motive was the same: loyalty to a dead cause. Even as others painted, sang, and studied, these zealots clung to the ghost of the Reich, enforcing silence through intimidation. For prisoners like Klaus, it became a daily act of courage simply to attend a class or speak his mind. He remembered a friend whispering to him one night, "If you say democracy too loudly, they will hear you through the walls." Yet, something remarkable happened. The killings, meant to inspire fear, instead exposed fanaticism for what it was, cowardice disguised as loyalty. Many prisoners began to turn away from the extremists. They saw that blind obedience had led them first to war, then to ruin, and now to murder. The fence no longer separated enemies. It divided the past from future. American officers, realizing this internal conflict, quietly transferred the most radical men to isolated compounds. The remaining prisoners, the artists, musicians, and thinkers, continued their transformation. By the war's end, a new consensus had taken hold, that the true enemy was not the Americans outside the fence, but the hatred they had carried within themselves. When Klaus boarded the ship for home, he looked back one last time at the camp. The towers, the barbed wire, the empty fields. He thought of Koons, the man who had died for speaking the truth, and of the violin he left behind. He whispered a promise. "I will remember the fence, not as a prison, but as a mirror." For many, the camps became the first place they saw freedom's true face, imperfect, sometimes hypocritical, but real. And for America, they were an unexpected experiment, in mercy, in humanity, and in the slow unlearning of hate. Behind the wire, enemies became men again, and in that quiet transformation, through art, through conscience, through courage, the war's final victory was not won by force, but by the fragile power of understanding. Part 7. The Shock of Defeat. On a warm spring morning in 1945, the loudspeakers crackled across hundreds of American POW camps. The voice of an American officer, formal and steady, announced the words that would shatter the prisoners' world. Germany has surrendered. The war is over. For most Americans, it was a day of jubilation, of parades, of flags, of the promise of peace. But for 425,000 German prisoners behind barbed wire, it was a day of silence. The men who had once marched to the rhythm of empire stood motionless. They looked at each other with hollow eyes. Their homeland, the reason for their suffering, their identity, had ceased to exist. The war was over, and yet, for them, it had just begun. In Camp Hun, Texas, the news spread like wildfire. Some men shouted that it was a lie, American propaganda, another trick to break their spirits. Others sat on their bunks, clutching photographs of wives and children they might never see again. Klaus, our quiet observer through this journey, felt a strange numbness. For years, he had told himself that survival depended on belief. Belief that Germany would endure, belief that he would return home to something recognizable. Now, that belief was gone. He later wrote in a letter, "When they told us the Rye had fallen, I did not feel defeat. I felt emptiness, as if the ground beneath my feet had turned to air." In some camps, the prisoners tore down the swastika flags they had hidden in their barracks. In others, the diehards still clung to them, holding midnight vigils as though the act alone could bring back a lost world. But then came the rumors, whispers drifting in from the newspapers and American radio broadcasts. They spoke of unimaginable things, of camps with names like Buchenwald and Dachau, of piles of shoes, gold teeth, and skeletal faces staring from behind the wire, faces that looked like their own, yet were condemned to die. At first, the POWs refused to believe it. "Lies," they said, "Allied propaganda." After all, how could they, the ordinary soldiers, have fought for a nation capable of such horror? But the truth did not fade. It grew. American camp officers began distributing photographs, official images released by the U.S. Army. They showed corpses stacked like firewood. They showed the ovens. They showed the insignias of the SS. The prisoners stared in disbelief. Some turned away in shame. Others broke down, weeping openly. A few tore up their medals and threw them into the date. Klaus described that moment years later. "I realized that what we had called duty was in truth blindness. I was not proud of my survival then. I was only grateful that I had not become part of that machine." Across America, the atmosphere within the camps changed overnight. The men who had once spoken proudly of victory now spoke softly, cautiously, as if ashamed to hear their own language aloud. The re-education officers, those American intellectuals who had once struggled to reach their prisoners, now found their classrooms full. Men who had mocked the lectures came to listen. They wanted answers. They wanted to understand how everything they had believed in could have led to such destruction. Books by Goethe, Schiller, and Kant replaced the Nazi propaganda pamphlets. A new German newspaper, Der Ruf, the Call, began circulating among camps. Edited by former soldiers, it urged its readers to build a new Germany, one of truth and conscience. It wrote, "We cannot return as conquerors. We must return as men who have learned." But learning was not easy. Every letter from home told a story of ruin. Cities burned, families displaced, mothers and wives scavenging for food amid rubble. In one message, a young prisoner read that his village in the Ruhr Valley no longer existed, bombed into dust. His parents had been killed. His sister had fled east and vanished. He folded the letter, placed it in his shirt pocket, and walked out to the fence. For an hour he stood staring through the wire at the empty horizon. Many others did the same. They did not cry. They simply stood in silence, the only gesture left when words could no longer bear the weight of what they had lost. And yet, even in that silence, something remarkable began to grow: empathy. The Americans who guarded them, once seen as enemies, became, in some ways, fellow mourners. Guards allowed the prisoners to listen to radio broadcasts of the Nuremberg trials. They did not gloat or punish. They simply let them hear. The men listened as their former leaders, Goering, Ribbentrop, Keitel, were tried and condemned. Some still clung to denial, but many understood at last. Klaus wrote, "It was strange to hear their voices again, men who had seemed like gods to us. Now they sounded small. We had followed small men into an abyss." For the Americans, too, the moment was complex. They looked at these captured soldiers, young, polite, bewildered, and wondered how they could be the same men whose country had built the gas chambers. The paradox deepened. The enemy before them was human, decent, even remorseful. It was easier when evil had a face, harder when it looked like your neighbor's son. In the months that followed, the camps grew quieter. No more singing of German marching songs. No more secret meetings in the barracks. The prisoners turned to gardening, painting, and reading. They built small wooden churches and carved crosses from scrap wood. Some began holding evening discussions, not about war, but about guilt, forgiveness, and rebuilding. Out of those conversations would come the first seeds of post-war reconciliation. Klaus remembered a night that summer when he stood outside under the stars. The fields were alive with fireflies. An American guard approached, lighting a cigarette. They stood in silence for a while. Then the guard said quietly, "It's over now. You'll go home soon." Klaus nodded. "Yes," he said, "but home will not be there." The guard hesitated, then offered him the cigarette. They smoked together, two men who had once tried to kill each other, now united by the quiet understanding that both had lost something that could never be recovered. For many prisoners, defeat became the first step toward self-knowledge. They began to see that survival was not just about returning home. It was about becoming worthy of home again. In letters smuggled out through the Red Cross, they wrote of rebuilding not only houses and bridges, but faith, truth, and dignity. Some dreamed of becoming teachers, artists, or journalists. Others vowed never to let another demagogue deceive their nation again. It was a kind of resurrection, fragile, uncertain, but real. The shock of defeat had broken them, but it had also freed them from illusion, from obedience, from the poison of certainty. When they finally looked beyond the fence, they no longer saw the enemy. They saw a world in need of repair, and they knew that repair had to begin with them. Years later, Klaus would tell his grandson that the hardest battle he ever fought was not in the fields of Normandy or the forests of France, but inside a POW camp in America. When he learned the truth about what his nation had done and what he himself had believed, he said, "The first victory of peace is to look in the mirror and not turn away." But for the prisoners, the reckoning was far from over. The war had ended, yet they remained behind barbed wire, waiting for ships, for orders, for permission to go home. And when those gates finally opened, what awaited them was not welcome, but the ruins of a world they no longer recognized. Part 8. The Long Road Home. By the winter of 1945, the war was over, yet the fences still stood. Across the vast expanse of America, from Arizona's deserts to the cornfields of Iowa, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners waited. Waited for news, waited for ships, waited to go home. For men like Klaus, it was a strange kind of limbo, a peace that felt like imprisonment. The Americans called it Operation Repatriation. It was a massive logistical effort, trains, trucks, and troop ships working to return 425,000 men across the ocean. But the victors faced a dilemma. Europe was in ruins. The ports were destroyed, the railways shattered, and food was scarce. Sending home so many mouths to feed could tip a starving continent into chaos. And so, the prisoners waited. Days became weeks, weeks became months. They harvested crops, repaired roads, built fences, and filled the aching silence with the routines of survival. Some camps were closed entirely, their men transferred to others still in operation. In the newspapers, Americans read about the good Germans, polite, hard-working men who had helped win the post-war harvest. But for the prisoners, the wait was agony. In Camp Shelby, Mississippi, a group of POWs carved a small wooden sign and nailed it above the gate. It read, "We are still here." There was bitterness in the humor. The war had ended, yet there remained, caught between guilt and hope. Letters trickled in through the Red Cross, most torn, censored, or smudged by rain. Many were filled with sorrow. Wives remarried. Children no longer recognized their fathers. Some learned that their entire families had perished beneath the bombs. Klaus received one letter from his brother, the only surviving relative he had left. It was short. "Our town is gone. I work for the British now, cleaning rubble. Come home if you can. We have nothing, but we are alive." Klaus folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his Bible. He read it every night. By early 1946, the first ships began to leave. The prisoners were loaded onto trains that snaked through the American countryside one last time, through fields they had plowed, towns they had passed silently behind fences. At the docks in New York and Boston, they were processed like cargo, their names listed, their pockets emptied, their belongings stored in canvas bags. One soldier wrote, "They treated us not as enemies, but as men whose time had finally come. The guard shook our hands." One said, "Good luck over there. You'll need it." He was right. The ships, Liberty vessels once used for war, were now filled with men bound for an uncertain peace. They slept in hammocks, sang quietly, and stared out at the endless horizon. Some spoke of the America they had seen, the kindness of farmers, the laughter of children, the vastness of the land. Klaus sat on the deck one night and watched the coastline fade into mist. He realized, with a shock, that he would miss it. He had arrived as a prisoner, but was leaving as something far more complex, a man who had found pieces of himself in the land of his enemy. But not all ships went to Germany. Some were rerouted to Britain and France. Those nations, devastated by war, needed labor, and the Allies had 3 million German POWs at their disposal. Thousands of Americans watched in disbelief as men who had worked on their farms and helped rebuild their communities were sent overseas once again, this time as laborers under new captors. The irony was not lost on the prisoners. They had survived one war, served one enemy, and now found themselves serving another. In British camps, they worked in fields and mines. In France, they cleared the ruins of bombed cities, often under harsh conditions. For many, the long road home stretched on for years. When Klaus finally reached Germany in 1947, it was not the home he had imagined. The cities were ghosts. The air smelled of ash and rain. Children played in bomb craters. Women queued for bread. He stood in what had once been his village and saw only the foundation stones of his house. The church spire was gone. The schoolyard, a crater. He felt a pang of guilt deeper than anything he had known in captivity. In America, the fences had kept him in. But now, the ruins kept him silent. There was no longer a Germany to belong to, only the memory of one. The returning POWs were not welcomed as heroes. They were ghosts, reminders of a war everyone wanted to forget. Jobs were scarce. The occupation authorities viewed them with suspicion. Many civilians whispered they lived well in America while we starved. Klaus tried to explain that captivity was not comfort, that peace could also be a prison. But no one wanted to hear it. He took work clearing rubble from a nearby city. Every brick he lifted felt like a confession. Every wall rebuilt was an attempt at redemption. Across Germany, millions of former soldiers faced the same struggle. Some retreated into silence, others began to write. From that silence emerged a new literature, diaries, poems, and memoirs from men who had seen America not as conqueror, but as mirror. They wrote of kindness and contradiction, of the paradox of being treated more humanely in captivity than they had been under their own regime, of discovering freedom not on a battlefield, but behind barbed wire. A few men returned to their captors, not as prisoners, but as immigrants. Farmers who had befriended POWs sponsored their return. American families sent letters inviting them to visit. One former guard married the sister of a German prisoner he had once watched over. The lines between victor and vanquished blurred into something new, reconciliation, born not from treaties, but from shared humanity. For Klaus, the years after repatriation were quiet ones. He married a widow, found work as a carpenter, and raised 2 children. He rarely spoke of the war, but sometimes, on winter evenings, he would take out his old Bible and unfold that letter from his brother, yellowed, torn, but still legible. He kept a photograph, too, of a wheat field in Kansas, where he had once worked as a prisoner. The sky endless, the horizon free. He told his son, "If you want to know where I learned what freedom means, look not at the front, but behind the fence." For all of them, the men who returned, the ones who stayed, and the ones who never spoke again, the journey home was more than a voyage across an ocean. It was a passage through guilt, loss, and awakening. They had been soldiers, then captives, then witnesses. And in the long road home, they became something else entirely, the first citizens of a new Germany, built not on pride, but on conscience. But not all went home. Some men, haunted by memory and drawn by unexpected affection, would choose to return to the land that once held them captive. In the next chapter, we follow the ones who stayed, men who crossed the ocean not for war, but for a second chance. Part 9. The Ones Who Stayed. When the last transport ships left American shores in 1947, the camps fell silent. The barracks stood empty, the watchtowers unmanned, the fields overgrown. But not everyone had boarded those ships. Some prisoners, a few hundred at first, then thousands over the years, found themselves drawn not back to the ruins of Germany, but to the strange, generous land that had once held them behind wire. They were the ones who stayed. For them, America had become more than a place of captivity. It had become a place of transformation. During the war, these men had labored in the fields, on ranches, and in canneries. They had mended fences, harvested cotton, built barns, and played baseball with local boys on lazy Sunday afternoons. The faces of their guards and employers had softened with time. There were no longer enemies, only men who shared sweat, laughter, and small kindnesses amid the dust and heat. When repatriation came, many prisoners hesitated. Returning home meant facing rubble, hunger, and silence. Staying meant hope, and perhaps even redemption. But the law was clear. They had to go. Every POW was to be repatriated. And so they left, but they did not forget. Years later, when immigration opened once again, they began to return. Some came back as farmhands, sponsored by the very families who had once fed them behind barbed wire. Others as students, teachers, or craftsmen. To the astonishment of many Americans, these former enemies arrived not with resentment, but with gratitude. In Texas, a man named Friedrich Naumann stepped off a ship in 1950 and made his way back to a small town called Herne, where he had once been a prisoner. He found the farm where he had worked and knocked on the door. The farmer's wife, older now, recognized him instantly. She threw her arms around him and said, "We always hoped you'd come back." Friedrich stayed. He married an American woman, raised children, and built a small dairy business. When asked why he returned, he smiled and said, "Because, hey, I learned what forgiveness looks like." Across the Midwest, similar stories unfolded. Quiet, tender, improbable. In Nebraska, a POW named Carl Becker had fallen in love with a farmer's daughter whose family he worked for. When he left, she waited. In 1949, after years of letters, he came back, not as a prisoner, but as her husband. In Georgia, a guard named Jack and a former German sergeant named Hans reunited after the war, exchanging letters about philosophy, politics, and baseball. They remained friends for 40 years. Such stories rarely made the headlines, but they formed a hidden chapter of post-war America, a testament to what can grow when hatred is left to die quietly in the soil. For the Germans who stayed, adapting to America was not easy. The accent, the customs, the haunted memories of what they had once fought for, all lingered. But America, too, was changing. The optimism of the 1950s, the growth of small towns, the spirit of rebuilding, all made room for those who sought new beginnings. Former POWs became carpenters, mechanics, teachers, and musicians. Some even joined the U.S. Army during the Korean War, a profound symbol of transformation, fighting now for the ideals they had once opposed. Klaus was among those who thought often of returning. In the late 1950s, long after his repatriation, he received a letter from a Kansas farmer named Bill Thompson, the man whose wheat fields he had once worked in captivity. The letter read, "If you ever wish to see the sky again, the one we used to talk about, there's a place for you here." Klaus never did return to live in America, but he kept that letter all his life. He said to his daughter once, "It reminded me that fences are not meant to keep men apart, only to test how far the heart can reach." There was another group who stayed in spirit, those who could not find peace anywhere else. For them, America became a symbol of what could have been, a country where freedom had proved stronger than fear. Some former POWs became writers, chronicling their experiences in memoirs that few read at the time. They wrote not of battle, but of awakening. They spoke of the kindness of ordinary Americans, of learning democracy not from lectures but from example. These accounts, once dismissed as sentimental, are now invaluable records of reconciliation. Even today, if you drive through small towns in Texas, Nebraska, or Oklahoma, you can still find traces of their presence. Names carved into barn beams, old photographs and family albums, young German men smiling awkwardly beside American farmers. And in some cemeteries, there are graves marked with iron crosses and American flags side by side. The inscription on one reads simply, "Once a prisoner, forever a friend." For the families of these men, the story did not end with them. Their children grew up bilingual, bicultural, their lives shaped by two histories that had once been at war. Some became teachers, artists, or veterans themselves. Others returned to Germany to find relatives they had never met, carrying letters of friendship written by Americans their fathers had once called enemies. The legacy of those who stayed became a living bridge between nations once divided by hatred. In 1989, long after the war's end, the town of Aliceville, Alabama, site of one of the largest POW camps in the United States, invited former prisoners to return for a reunion. Dozens came, now elderly men with families of their own. They stood before the place where the fence had once stood. The fields were green again, the barracks gone. One of them, a frail man with silver hair, said softly to a reporter, "When I came here, I was a soldier. When I left, I was a human being." The town band played the German folk song Lily Marleen. The crowd applauded, and many wept. The story of the German POWs in America is not one of triumph or tragedy alone. It is a story of transformation, of how men can find their humanity not through victory, but through loss, not through conquest, but through compassion. For those who stayed, America became a home built on the fragile, enduring foundation of forgiveness. And for the Americans who welcomed them back, the act of kindness became its own quiet victory. Klaus once said to his grandson, History will tell you who fought, but only memory can tell you who forgave. And in that, perhaps, lies the true legacy of the ones who stayed. Decades have passed since the fences came down, yet the echoes of that strange chapter still linger, in stories, in graves, in the quiet fields where enemies once worked side by side. In our final episode, we look back across the decades to ask one question. What remains today are the camps, the men, and the lessons they left behind. Part 10, Legacy and Memory. Time, like the wind across the plains, erases what it cannot carry. The watchtowers have vanished. The barbed wire has rusted into the soil. The camps where thousands of German soldiers once lived behind fences are now open fields, forgotten by most who passed them. But memory, fragile, stubborn, human memory, endures. It lingers in the hearts of those who remember, and in the land itself, which once bore witness to a quiet miracle. Enemies who became neighbors, captives who became friends, and a nation that discovered mercy in the aftermath of war. When the war ended in 1945, over 425,000 German prisoners of war had been held across the United States, from the deserts of Arizona to the farmlands of Iowa, from the pine forests of Georgia to the windswept plains of Kansas. They had arrived as the defeated soldiers of a brutal regime. Many were hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had seen horror beyond imagining. Yet in America, they were met not with vengeance, but with discipline tempered by decency. The Geneva Convention had been honored. They were fed well, treated fairly, and even paid small wages for their labor. They worked the fields, repaired roads, harvested crops, and built what the war had left undone. In doing so, they helped feed the very nation that had defeated them. It was never meant to be a moral lesson, but it became one. Through daily acts of civility, through the quiet example of fairness, America showed these men another way of living, one that did not rely on fear, obedience, or ideology. To many, it was their first real encounter with democracy, not as propaganda, but as a way of life. And when they returned to Germany, they carried it home like an ember in the dark. Historians now believe that the experience of captivity in America shaped the rebuilding of post-war Germany in subtle but profound ways. Former POWs became teachers, architects, engineers, and politicians. They rebuilt their country not in the image of the rye they had lost, but of the freedom they had glimpsed across the ocean. It is said that in the early years of West Germany, local councils and trade unions were often led by men who had once been POWs in the United States. They had seen how a free society functioned, how citizens could disagree without destroying one another. And when they spoke of America, it was not as a conqueror, but as a mentor. Yet for all the stories of friendship and redemption, there were also shadows. Not every man changed. Some returned embittered, humiliated, haunted by guilt or loss. Others refused to speak of their time behind the wire at all. And in the towns where the camps had stood, memory too faded. The barracks were torn down, the guard towers dismantled. The fields plowed once more for wheat or cotton. By the 1960s, only a few old-timers remembered the strange season when the countryside had filled with German voices singing Lily Marleen. But memory has a way of returning, often when least expected. In the 1980s and 1990s, historians began to rediscover the story of America's German POWs. Old photographs surfaced in attics. Letters were found in family trunks. Letters between farmers and their wartime workers, between guards and their prisoners. Museums were founded in towns like Aliceville, Herne, and Concordia. There, aging veterans on both sides came together, not to relive the war, but to remember its humanity. They brought their children and grandchildren, pointing to faded photos, telling stories that had been buried for half a century. Some wept, others laughed, and many said the same thing. We were enemies once, but not anymore. In one of those museums, there is a single artifact that seems to hold the whole story in miniature. A wooden carving, small, delicate, hand-shaped from scrap lumber, made by a German prisoner in 1944. It depicts two hands clasped together through a strand of barbed wire. On its base, burned into the wood, are the words in both languages. Kein Zorn hält Freundschaft auf. No fence can hold friendship. For decades, that phrase seemed to define the spirit of those camps, a paradox of captivity that bred compassion. But as time passed, the story became more than a warm memory. It became a parable, one that spoke to what nations can be when they choose dignity over hatred, understanding over fear. In a world still divided by new fences, new wars, and new ideologies, the lesson of those camps feels more urgent than ever. Klaus, the fictional heart of our story, was one among hundreds of thousands. But his experience, the transformation from soldier to human being, mirrors countless real lives. He survived not because he was strong, but because he was seen. He found grace not in victory, but in the ordinary kindness of strangers who treated him as more than a uniform. Years later, as an old man, he wrote these words in a letter to his grandson. "The war taught me how cruel men can be. America taught me how kind they can choose to be. Never forget, both live inside us. Every day, we must choose which to feed." The story of the German POWs in America is not one of simple goodness. There were injustices, grief, and contradictions. But within that web of human frailty, something extraordinary occurred. A brief moment when humanity outshone vengeance. It reminds us that even in war, especially in war, mercy can be a weapon stronger than hate. And that sometimes the most profound victories are the ones no one celebrates, because they happen quietly in the hearts of ordinary men. Today, where the camps once stood, wildflowers bloom. Children play where gods once patrolled. The earth remembers, but it forgives. Every spring, in places like Concordia and Aliceville, locals still find bits of history turned up by the plow, a belt buckle, a spoon, a rusted tag stamped with a number, each one a whisper from the past. And somewhere, far away, in a German attic, an old man's diary still lies open to a page that reads simply, "America, 1944. I came as a soldier. I left as a man." History will always remember the battles, the victories, the losses, the grand strategies that shaped the 20th century. But beyond the front lines, behind the barbed wire, there was another war, quieter, more enduring. It was a struggle to remain human in a time when humanity seemed lost. And in that war, perhaps, both sides won. This has been the other side of the fence, a story of captivity, compassion, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. For in the end, history is not only written by the victors, it is remembered by those who learn how to forgive.